Today, we're going to talk about one of the most brutal and honestly, most important sea voyages in all of human history. It's a story that started with a simple craving for flavor and somehow ended up redrawing the entire map of the world and kicking off centuries of conflict. This is the wild story of Vasco da Gama's voyage to India.
And it really all boils down to this one powerful line from the man himself: "My hunger found India." And you got to understand, he wasn't just talking about a hunger for fame or for gold. Nope. He meant a literal hunger for taste, a desperation so deep it would push men right into the jaws of death.
So to even begin to wrap our heads around a journey this insane, we have to go back and understand the world it came from. And that world was, well, for most people, it was just utterly, completely bland. Okay, so picture this. On one side, you've got 15th century Europe. Think long, cold, miserable winters. And the food, bland, boiled meat, or meat so heavily salted you could barely taste it, that was just to keep it from rotting. Then on the other side, you have the idea of India. It was like a dream, a warm, magical land with unbelievable wealth and these things called spices: pepper, cloves, cinnamon, stuff that could make those grim meals actually taste like something. This wasn't just a want, it was a deep, desperate craving.
But, and this is a huge but, there was a massive problem. Arab merchants had a total monopoly on the spice trade. They'd buy spices for cheap in India, trek them across the land, and sell them in Europe for literally the price of gold. Now, if you were a king in Portugal or Spain, this was infuriating. You're basically being held hostage for flavor. The mainland route was blocked by the Ottoman Empire, so they looked to the only place left, the terrifying, completely unknown ocean.
And let me tell you, this was a gamble on a scale that is hard to even imagine today. The ocean back then wasn't just a big body of water. It was a realm of monsters, myths, and pure terror.
I mean, you have to put yourself in their shoes. These sailors genuinely believed the world was flat and that you could just fall off the edge. They were convinced that giant sea monsters were down there just waiting to swallow their ships whole. A storm wasn't just bad weather. No, it was the literal wrath of God coming to get you. Sailing out into the open Atlantic was, for many, basically a suicide mission.
And you know what? They had every single reason to be terrified. Just 10 years earlier, another Portuguese explorer, a guy named Bartolomeu Diaz, he gave it a shot. He actually made it to the southern tip of Africa, but then he was met by waves he described as mountainous and storms so violent his crew just shattered. He named the place the Cape of Storms, turned his ship around, and literally fled back to Portugal in absolute terror.
But where Diaz saw nothing but death, another man saw a golden opportunity. Enter Vasco da Gama. Now this guy was different. He was known for being stubborn, almost fanatical, a man who didn't fear the sea. He wanted to conquer it. So when the King of Portugal asked him if he could do what Diaz couldn't, he basically said, "Look, if the sea doesn't kill me, I'll bring you the entire world on a silver platter."
And just like that, one of the most hellish voyages in human history began. The day they left Lisbon wasn't some big celebration. No, it was described as being more like a mass funeral. Families were on the shore, wailing, crying, as if they were watching their men being led to their own execution. And in a way, they were.
Once they were out on the open sea, all those nightmare scenarios became real. They didn't have GPS. They had the stars and blind faith. Massive Atlantic storms ripped their sails to shreds. The constant violent rocking of the ships meant everyone was horribly seasick all the time. But even the storms were nothing compared to the silent, gruesome killer that started to creep through the decks.
Scurvy. After months without any fresh food, their bodies just started to fall apart from the inside out. Their gums would bleed constantly, their teeth would loosen, rot, and literally fall out into their hands. Huge, disgusting boils would pop up all over their skin. The lower decks of these ships became nothing more than a floating morgue, and every single day, more bodies were just unceremoniously dumped overboard.
The crew that was left, they finally broke. They staged a mutiny, surrounding da Gama, begging him to turn back. They didn't care about India anymore. They just wanted to live. But da Gama, he wasn't just a captain. He was a fanatic. In a moment of absolute madness, he pulled out a sword, grabbed all of their navigational tools, and threw them into the ocean. He then roared at his men that their only options now were to reach India or die trying. And he made it crystal clear. Anyone who even mentioned turning back would be cut down by his own hand.
Driven by this terrifying iron will, they finally reached the spot that had broken Diaz, the Cape of Storms. They fought through the chaos, and after days of what must have felt like an eternity, a miracle. The storm broke. The sea calmed. They had done the impossible. Da Gama immediately renamed the Cape of Good Hope, because for them, they had just broken through the very door of death and into a new, unknown world, the Indian Ocean.
And just like that, they were in a completely different reality. They were battered, half dead, but for the first time in a very long time, they actually felt a glimmer of hope. All they had to do now was find where they were going.
Well, after getting some help from a local navigator in East Africa, they sailed east. And then, on May 20th, 1498, the air itself changed. For the first time in months, the smell wasn't rot and salt water and sickness. It was this incredible, intoxicating scent of sandalwood, cardamom, and black pepper. They had made it. They had arrived in Calicut, India. The few sailors who could still walk stumbled onto the beach, fell to their knees, and just wept, kissing the sand. But the culture shock was, well, immediate and almost comical. Da Gama came ashore thinking he was arriving in some savage, backward land, but Calicut was a bustling, thriving, cosmopolitan city. And when they finally met the local king, the Zamorin, the difference was just hilarious. The Zamorin was sitting on a throne of pure gold, covered head to toe in jewels. And Da Gama's gifts for this magnificent king? A couple of cheap wool hats, some brass pots, and a few jars of honey. The story goes that the Zamorin's courtiers just burst out laughing at the sight of it. But here's the thing. Despite these pathetic gifts, the Zamorin, following a long-standing Indian tradition of hospitality to strangers, welcomed these ragged, weird-looking foreigners. He actually granted them permission to trade in his city. It was an act of pure generosity, an act that would have absolutely devastating consequences.
Because you see, Vasco da Gama hadn't just opened a trade route. He had kicked open Pandora's box. The unimaginable wealth he saw in India didn't inspire respect. It ignited a fire of pure greed in his mind.
When Da Gama finally limped back to Portugal, the small cargo of spices he was carrying, even after losing ships and most of his men, yielded a 60-fold profit. Let me say that again. A 60-fold profit. That's a 6 times 1,000% return on investment. A number that big doesn't just make you rich, it creates an obsession.
And that news spread across Europe like wildfire. Suddenly, every kingdom wanted a piece of the pie. The Portuguese came back, but this time they didn't build trading posts, they built military forts. Then the Dutch and the French showed up with their warships. And finally, the most cunning and ruthless of them all, the British East India Company. It was a full-blown feeding frenzy.
The once peaceful shores of Calicut, which for centuries had been this amazing global hub for the exchange of goods and ideas, were transformed. The air that once smelled of spices now smelled of gunpowder. That friendly welcome the Zamorin gave to a few lost sailors had been twisted into an invitation for conquest and plunder.
The centuries that followed were, let's be honest, incredibly dark ones, filled with exploitation and subjugation. But that is not the end of this story.
You see, what the colonial powers never really understood is that India wasn't just a piece of land on a map you could discover or conquer. It's an idea. It's an immortal spirit, and this quote just captures it perfectly. You can cage the golden bird for a time, but you cannot stop its flight forever.
So, in the end, yeah, Da Gama's journey was an unbelievable feat of human endurance. No one can deny that. But its legacy is just so much more complicated. It leaves us with this huge, lingering question. Was this a great discovery that connected two worlds? Was it the bloody start of a brutal invasion? Or was it all just a fateful accident born from a simple hunger for spice that ended up changing the entire course of human history forever?